Nell was pouring the claret when the Duke said it. She had positioned herself at the far end of the sideboard, half concealed by the heavy damask curtains, her movements measured and invisible, the way she had trained them to be over the past 4 months. The dinner had been proceeding with the stiff-mannered formality that all such evenings followed at Aldermere House. 12 guests arranged along the long mahogany table, candlelight catching the crystal, the low murmur of conversation drifting between the courses like fog moving across the Dorset cliffs beyond the windows. The Dowager Duchess Honoria had arranged the evening. She arranged all such evenings now, with the relentless optimism of a woman who had decided her son would marry whether he wished it or not. The young women she invited were always beautiful and accomplished. Tonight's principal guest was Miss Felstead, the daughter of a baronet from Hampshire, a striking woman with auburn hair and an easy, confident laugh. She had been seated at the Duke's right hand, which was the position of greatest favor, and for most of the evening she had acquitted herself well. She had spoken charmingly about the gardens. She had complimented the wine. She had laughed at the vicar's dull anecdote about a lost terrier. Then she had made her mistake. The conversation had turned, as conversations at great houses often did, to the question of reform. A gentleman across the table had mentioned the latest pamphlets circulating in London, the calls for wider education, the radicals who argued that learning should not be confined to men of means. Miss Felstead, emboldened perhaps by the wine or by the easy warmth of the evening, had offered her own view. She spoke with intelligence and precision. She cited a philosopher Nell recognized. She made a careful, reasoned argument about the merits of an educated populace. It was by any measure a thoughtful contribution. The silence that followed was not one of admiration. Hadrian Voss, the 9th Duke of Ashworth, set down his glass. He was seated at the head of the table, his tall frame rigid against the carved back of his chair, his face cast in the sharp contrasts of candlelight and shadow. Had the look of a man sculpted from the same pale stone as his ancestral home, dark hair, severe brow, a jaw that seemed incapable of softening. His eyes were the color of deep winter water, and they held no warmth at all. He looked at Miss Felstead, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet, devastating authority of a man who had never once needed to raise it. No man wants a clever wife. He wants a peaceful house, and a woman who understands the value of silence. The words did not land like an insult. They landed like a verdict. Miss Felstead's face drained of color. Her hand, which had been gesturing with graceful emphasis a moment before, fell to the table. The other guests stared at their plates. The Dowager Duchess closed her eyes briefly, a flicker of exhaustion crossing her proud features. Nell stood motionless behind the curtain, the decanter steady in her hand, her face betraying nothing. She had learned long ago to make her expression as blank as plaster, to let words pass through her the way wind passes through an open window, without catching on anything. But these words caught. They sank into her chest like a fishhook, sharp and barbed, because they were not merely the opinion of a cold and arrogant man. They were a confirmation of everything she already knew about the world she now inhabited. Cleverness in a woman was not a virtue. It was a liability. It was a thing to be hidden, suppressed, buried so deep that no trace of it could reach the surface. And Nell had a great deal to hide. The dinner ended shortly after. Miss Felstead departed with her father, her composure admirable, but her eyes bright with unshed humiliation. The house staff began the long, meticulous work of clearing the dining room. Nell moved among them, collecting glasses, folding linen, her hands performing the work while her mind moved elsewhere. By the following morning, the Duke's words had completed their journey through the household. They had traveled from the dining room to the butler's pantry to the kitchen to the laundry and finally to the servants' hall, where they settled like sediment at the bottom of a glass. The footman repeated them with smirking approval. The cook shook her head and said it was a wonder any woman would want him at all. The other maids whispered and glanced at one another with the particular satisfaction of people who have just been told that the quality they lack is not, after all, worth having. But it was Mrs. Arden who seized upon the words and fashioned them into a weapon. Mrs. Arden was the governess of Aldermere House, though the title was generous. She had been hired 18 months ago to manage the education and care of the Duke's young niece, a task at which she had failed so completely that her continued employment was itself a mystery. She was a tall, angular woman with a narrow face and pale, watchful eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. She ran her small domain with a brittle, defensive authority, and she had disliked Nell from the moment the girl had arrived. The dislike had a specific origin. 3 days after Nell had taken up her position at Aldermere, Mrs. Arden had found her in the schoolroom. Nell had been sent to dust, a routine task, but Mrs. Arden had entered to discover her standing before the blackboard, her cloth forgotten in her hand, her gaze fixed on a mathematical problem that had been left half-solved from the morning's lesson. Mrs. Prof. Arden had written it there herself, copied from a primer, and had been unable to complete it. She had left it on the board, intending to erase it before anyone noticed. But Nell had noticed, and in that unguarded moment before she heard the door, her hand had moved almost involuntarily. She had picked up the chalk and completed the equation in 3 swift, certain strokes. Mrs. Arden had seen it. She had seen the speed, the confidence, the casual ease of it, and something cold had settled behind her eyes. She had said nothing at the time. She had simply taken the cloth from Nell's hand and told her to leave. But from that day forward, her scrutiny had been relentless. Now, armed with the Duke's own declaration, Mrs. Arden acted. She gathered the female staff in the servants' hall that afternoon and delivered a speech that was, in its own way, as devastating as the Duke's. She reminded them that their positions depended upon their discretion, their obedience, and above all their understanding of their place. She said that any servant who displayed learning or opinions or any form of intellectual vanity would be dismissed without a character reference. She looked directly at Nell as she said it. The other maids looked too. Nell felt their eyes like the points of pins, dozens of them pressing into her skin. She kept her own gaze fixed on the floor, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing even. She had endured worse. She would endure this, but she understood the message perfectly. Mrs. Arden had drawn a circle around her, and the circle was shrinking. Nell returned to her work. She carried her bucket and brushes to the east corridor, where the sea light came in pale and gray through the tall windows, and she began to scrub the tiles with a slow, thorough rhythm that had become her camouflage. Her hands moved in circles. Her mind moved in straight lines, calculating, planning, searching for the path she had not yet found. She had been at Aldermere for 4 months. She had mapped every corridor, every staircase, every locked door and unused room. She had learned the habits of every member of the household, from the Duke's solitary dawn walks along the cliff path to the cook's nightly ritual of checking the larder locks. She knew which floorboards creaked and which doors could be opened without sound, and she knew that the one room she needed most was the one room she could not reach, the study. Not the library, which was vast and open and used by the household for general purposes, but the Duke's private study on the 2nd floor, the room his father had used before him. The room where the late Duke had kept his personal correspondence, his records of patronage, and the papers of the scholars he had supported, scholars like her father. The study was always locked. The Duke carried the key himself. And now, with Mrs. Arden watching her every movement, even the possibility of getting close to it was slipping away from her like water through her raw, reddened fingers. She scrubbed harder, pressing the bristles into the grout until her knuckles ached. It was then that she heard it, a sound so small it was almost nothing. A soft, bare footstep on the tiles behind her. Then another. Then silence. Nell did not turn around. She had heard this before. She knew who it was without looking. the way one knows the presence of a shadow by the change in the light. A moment passed, then a small warm weight settled against her side. A body, slight and bony, pressed into the curve of her hip. A head, covered in tangled dark hair, came to rest against her arm. Oddly. The child was 6 years old. She had her mother's dark hair and her uncle, the Duke's winter-water eyes, and she had not spoken a single word in over a year, not since the morning her mother, Lady Honora, had failed to wake up. The physicians had called it a fever of the blood. The household had called it a tragedy. Adelie had called it nothing at all, because from that morning forward, the little girl had simply stopped. She would not speak, laugh, or cry. She existed in a pocket of silence so profound it unsettled everyone who came near her. The nursemaids had tried and failed. 2 governesses before Mrs. Arden had resigned in despair. Mrs. Arden herself had adopted a strategy of rigid routine and firm discipline, which had produced no words, but had produced something worse. The child had begun to rage. She bit. She scratched. She threw whatever was closest to hand. The household staff avoided her with a superstitious dread that bordered on cruelty. They whispered that she was touched, that her mother's death had broken something inside her that could never be mended. But she did not bite Nell. She did not scratch her or throw things at her. From the very first week, the child had simply appeared. In the corridor where Nell was polishing the brasswork. In the kitchen garden where Nell was carrying linens to the drying line. In the boot room where Nell was blacking the household shoes. She never announced herself. She never made a demand. She simply materialized, silent and watchful, and pressed herself against Nell's side like a small animal seeking warmth. Nell had not encouraged it. She had simply continued her work, steady and unhurried, and let the child be. She understood silence. She understood the need to exist beside another person without being required to perform. She understood it because she lived inside that same silence every day. The first time it happened, a scullery maid had seen them and told the cook, who told the housekeeper, who told Mrs. Arden. The governess had been furious. She had marched to the east corridor and physically pulled Adelie away from Nell's side. The child had not screamed. She had done something far worse. She had gone limp, utterly and completely, like a puppet whose strings had been cut, and she had stared at Mrs. Arden with those flat winter eyes, until the governess, shaken despite herself, had released her arm. Adelie had walked back to Nell and pressed herself against her side once more. Since that day, the incidents had multiplied. The child sought Nell the way water seeks the lowest ground, instinctively and without apparent effort. She would slip away from the schoolroom, from the nursery, from whatever supervised activity Mrs. Arden had prescribed, and she would find Nell. It did not matter where in the house Nell was working. The child found her every time. Mrs. Arden saw this as a direct assault on her authority. A governess who could not control her charge was a governess who had no purpose, and a woman without purpose in a great house was a woman in danger. She saw Nell not as a comfort to a grieving child, but as evidence of her own failure, and she responded the only way she knew how, with restriction, with surveillance, with the slow, methodical tightening of rules designed to keep them apart. And now, with the Duke's own words as her justification, she had the power to do it openly. The clever maid who had completed the equation on the blackboard. The quiet girl who had somehow bewitched a child that no one else could reach. These were not virtues in Mrs. Arden's world. They were threats. Nell felt Adelie's head press harder against her arm. The child's breathing was slow and even, almost drowsy. Her small fingers found the hem of Nell's apron and held it, not clutching, just resting, as if the fabric were a mooring line. Nell closed her eyes for a moment. The ache in her chest was familiar now, a constant companion, the particular pain of being needed by someone you might have to abandon. She could not afford this. Her mission was too important. Everything she had sacrificed over the past 2 years, her name, her comfort, her place in the world, All of it would mean nothing if she allowed herself to be derailed by tenderness. But she did not push the child away. Not yet. She let Ottilie rest against her for a few moments more, while the sea light shifted on the tiles and the distant sound of the waves came faintly through the windows. She let her stay, because some cruelties were beyond her even now. Her name was not Nell. Her name was Carenza Lydell, and she had come to Aldermere House to recover the life that had been stolen from her. Her father, Emery Lydell, had been a mathematician of rare brilliance, not the kind that attracted public fame, but the quiet, deep, patient kind that earned the respect of those who understood what they were seeing. He had spent 30 years working on a treatise that unified several branches of mathematical theory, a work so original that his colleagues believed it would reshape the field for generations. He had also been a generous and trusting man, a quality that in the end had destroyed him. His assistant, a younger scholar named Arden, had worked alongside him for nearly a decade. Arden was clever, but not original, ambitious, but not gifted. He had access to every page of the treatise. He knew the arguments, the proofs, the structure. He knew that Emery Lydell was in failing health, and that his only heir was a daughter with no standing in the academic world. 6 months before Emery's death, Arden had begun to copy. Not crudely, not in haste, but with careful, patient thoroughness. He copied the core theorems, restructured the chapters, and rewrote the introductions in his own voice, keeping the substance but changing the clothing. And when Emery Lydell finally succumbed to the illness that had been slowly claiming him, Arden moved with devastating speed. He published the treatise under his own name within 4 months. The academic world accepted Arden's claim without serious question. He received a chair at a prestigious institution, invitations, honors, the full machinery of recognition that should have been Emery Lydell's legacy. And then he turned his attention to the rest. The property, a modest but beautiful house called Briar Cottage in the hills of Somerset, had been left to Carenza in her father's will. But Arden produced a second will, one that predated the original, one that left the property to him in recognition of years of faithful service. The solicitor who might have challenged it was in Arden's pocket. The witnesses were his associates. Carenza, 20 years old, grieving, and utterly alone, was informed by letter that she had no claim. She had lost everything: her father's work, her home, her name. She had spent a year in destitution, working as a seamstress in a cramped boarding house in Bath, her scholar's hands learning the needle, while her scholar's mind raged against the injustice. Then a letter had found her. It was from a doctor, Ampion, an elderly astronomer who had been her father's closest friend. He had heard rumors of Arden's theft. He had examined the published treatise and recognized passages that could only have come from Emery Lydell's hand. But recognition was not proof. The original manuscripts, the pages in her father's unmistakable handwriting, were the only evidence that could expose the fraud. And Dr. Campion believed he knew where they were. Emery Lydell had been a frequent guest at Aldermere House during the time of the previous Duke, a man of deep intellectual curiosity who had been patron and friend to several scholars. Campion recalled Emery mentioning that he had entrusted certain papers to the Duke for safekeeping, fearing that Arden's ambitions were growing dangerous. Original drafts of the key theorems, annotated notebooks, perhaps even a letter of testimony explaining his fears. If those papers still existed, they would be in the late Duke's private study at Aldermere, the room that his son, the 9th Duke, now kept locked. So Carenza Lydell had vanished. And Nell, a quiet, capable girl with a forged character and a story of having been raised in an orphanage, had presented herself at Aldermere House, seeking a position as a housemaid. She had been hired without suspicion. She was clean, obedient, and efficient. She was exactly what a great house wanted in a junior maid. Invisible. But invisibility, she was learning, was not enough. She needed access. And access required opportunity. And opportunity was precisely what Mrs. Arden was determined to deny her. Because Mrs. Arden, the governess of Aldermere House, was the sister of the man who had stolen her father's life work. Carenza did not know whether Mrs. Arden was aware of the full scope of her brother's crime. She suspected not, at least not yet. But Mrs. Arden's instincts were sharp, and she had sensed from the beginning that Nell was not what she appeared. The incident with the equation on the blackboard had confirmed what her instincts had whispered, and now the Duke's own words had given her permission to act. Carenza looked down at the child pressed against her side. Audley's eyes were closed now, her breathing slow and trusting. The hem of Nell's apron was still caught loosely in her small fingers. Two broken things, finding each other in a house full of secrets. It was the most dangerous comfort in the world. Carenza gently eased the fabric from the child's grip, picked up her brush, and returned to her work. She did not look back as Audley's eyes opened, as the small face registered the withdrawal, as the child sat for a moment on the cold tiles, alone again, before rising silently and padding away down the corridor on bare feet. She did not look back, because if she did, she would not be able to stop herself from reaching out, and reaching out was a luxury that Carenza Lydell could no longer afford. The separation came 3 days after the Duke's dinner. Mrs. Riggin. Arden did not announce it. She did not need to. She simply rearranged the architecture of the household until the distance between Nell and Audley became impassable. The child's schedule was restructured. Mealtimes were shifted. The nursery was moved from the east wing to the west, as far from the servants' working corridors as the geography of the house allowed. A new nursemaid, a thick-armed, humorless woman named Brant, was hired specifically to shadow Audley at all hours. Brant had no warmth and no imagination, but she had the one quality Mrs. Arden valued above all others. She followed instructions without question. Audley was no longer permitted to wander. The schoolroom door was locked from the outside during lesson hours. The nursery door was locked at night. The garden walks that had once given the child her only taste of freedom were replaced by supervised circuits of the West Terrace, always within Mrs. Arden's line of sight, always with Brant's heavy hand ready to steer her back if she so much as turned her head toward the east wing. Carenza felt the change before she understood it. The corridors were emptier. The small, familiar weight against her side did not appear. She worked through her morning tasks in the east wing, and no bare feet padded up behind her. By the second day, the absence had become a physical sensation, a hollow space at her hip where the child used to press, an ache in her arm where the small head used to rest. On the third day, she saw Audley. It was early afternoon. Carenza was carrying a stack of pressed linens through the long gallery that connected the east and west wings. She was halfway along its length when she heard them coming from the opposite direction. The heavy tread of Brant's boots. The lighter, reluctant shuffle of the child's slippers. They rounded the corner, and there she was. Audley, dressed in a starched white pinafore, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it stretched the skin at her temples. She looked smaller than Carenza remembered, as if the 3 days of enforced separation had physically diminished her. Her face was blank, her winter water eyes fixed on the floor. Then she looked up. The moment their eyes met, something broke in the child's composure. Her face crumpled, not into tears. Audley never cried, but into something rawer and more wrenching, a look of desperate, wordless appeal. She lunged forward, her small body straining against Brant's grip, her arms reaching out toward Carenza with a ferocity that was almost violent. Brant held her. The woman's thick fingers closed around the child's upper arm, not cruelly, but with an immovable firmness. Audley thrashed. She kicked. She opened her mouth in a silent scream, her face contorted with an anguish that was all the more terrible for its soundlessness. Carenza stood frozen, the linens clutched against her chest. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to drop them, to kneel, to gather the child into her arms. Then she saw Mrs. Arden. The governess had appeared at the far end of the gallery. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped at her waist, her pale eyes watching. She was not intervening. She was observing. She was waiting to see what Nell would do, and in that waiting was the entire machinery of the trap. If Carenza reached for the child, it would be grounds for dismissal, and dismissal meant the end of everything. Carenza looked at Audley. The child's arms were still outstretched, her fingers grasping at the empty air between them. Her mouth was still open in that terrible silent cry. Carenza lowered her gaze. She pressed the linens tighter against her chest. She took a step backward, then another. She turned and walked away. She walked with the steady, measured pace of a woman carrying household linen through a gallery. Her spine was straight, and her chin was level, and her feet struck the marble floor in a rhythm as regular as a metronome. She walked until she reached the service door at the end of the corridor, and she pushed through it into the narrow stairwell beyond, and she closed the door behind her, and she stood in the darkness of that cramped, cold space with the linen still pressed to her chest, and she shook. She shook without sound, the way she had learned to do. The tremors ran through her body in waves, her jaw clenched so hard the bones ached, her eyes burning with tears she would not shed. She could still see the child's face, those outstretched arms, that silent, unbearable scream. She had walked away from the only person in this house who needed her. She had done it to survive. She had done it for her mission. She had done it because she had no choice. And it was the cruelest thing she had ever done in her life. Above her, 2 floors up, Hadrian Voss stood at the window of his study. He had seen it all. The study overlooked the long gallery through a narrow interior window, a peculiarity of the house's old construction that most of the household had forgotten existed. He had watched the child lunge. He had watched the maid freeze. He had watched Mrs. Arden appear at the far end of the gallery like a sentinel, her posture rigid with anticipation, and he had watched the girl walk away. It was the walking that disturbed him. Not the child's distress, which he had grown, to his private shame, too accustomed to. It was the precise, controlled, devastated way the girl had turned her back on a child reaching for her. He knew that walk. He had performed it himself 100 times, the walk of a person who is holding themselves together by nothing more than the architecture of their own will. He stood at the window for a long time after the gallery below had emptied. Something was wrong with this house. He had known it for months, in the way one knows about a crack in a foundation, not by seeing it, but by the way doors begin to stick and walls begin to lean. Audley's silence, the staff's unease, the strange gravity that seemed to pull the child toward this one unremarkable maid, and now the governess policing a bond between a grieving child and the only person who seemed to offer her peace. He had allowed it. He had allowed all of it. Mrs. Arden's rules, her restructuring of the nursery, her increasingly rigid control over his niece. He had allowed it because it was easier than engaging with it, because looking at Audley meant looking at the sister he had lost, and the promise he had failed to keep. Honora had asked him. In those final delirious hours, she had gripped his hand with a strength that seemed impossible in her wasted body, and she had said, "Take care of her, Hadrian. She is all that is left of me. Promise me." He had promised, and then he had delegated that promise to a governess and a locked nursery door, and he had retreated to this study, to his ledgers and his letters and his cold, controlled solitude, and he had told himself it was enough. Watching the maid walk away from his niece, he knew it was not. His mother arrived from the dower house the following afternoon. The Dowager Duchess Honoria was 71 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had never once in her life doubted her right to walk into any room and rearrange it according to her preferences. She was small, sharp-featured, and possessed of a gaze so penetrating that the household staff often said she could read a lie before it had finished forming on the liar's lips. She found him in the library, which was the public room. The large open space filled with the general collection. He was standing at the window, which she noted with the precision of a diagnostician. Hadrian at his desk meant Hadrian working. Hadrian at the window meant Hadrian brooding. "You look dreadful," she said, settling herself into a chair. "Have you been eating? Or are you surviving on duty and displeasure, as usual? Mother." "Do not mother me. I have driven an hour over appalling roads because your butler wrote to me. He is worried about Audley. So am I. So should you be." Hadrian turned from the window. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was tight, a sign his mother recognized. "I am aware of the situation. Are you? Then perhaps you can explain to me why your niece, a child of 6 who has already lost her mother, is now being kept under lock and key by a woman who has all the maternal instinct of a turnip. Mrs. Arden is managing a difficult situation." "Mrs. Arden is managing Mrs. Arden," Honoria said tartly. "She is protecting her position, not the child. That woman has turned the nursery into a prison because she cannot bear the humiliation of a child preferring a housemaid to her governess. The housemaid is not her concern." "No, the housemaid is yours," his mother said, her voice sharpening. "Or she should be. I have heard about the girl, Nell, the quiet one, the one Audley follows." "Tell me about her." "There is nothing to tell. She is a junior maid. She does her work competently. And the child gravitates to her, like iron to a lodestone. Does that not strike you as remarkable? Your niece, who has rejected every living soul in this house, who has not spoken a word in over a year, who bites and scratches and rages at anyone who comes near, sits peacefully at this girl's side. And your response is to let your governess build a wall between them." Hadrian said nothing. His silence was not agreement. It was the silence of a man confronting a truth he was not yet willing to voice. Honoria pressed. She had not driven an hour over rutted roads to be gentle. "I watched you at dinner last week," she said. "No man wants a clever wife. Those were your words. They were foolish, and you know it. You said them because Miss Felsted's intelligence frightened you, because a woman who thinks for herself is a woman you cannot control, and control is the only thing you have left since Honora died." Hadrian's eyes flashed. "That is enough." "It is not nearly enough," Honoria said, unmoved. "You have retreated from every human connection since your sister's death. You have hidden behind your title and your duties and your cold, impeccable manners, and you have convinced yourself that this is strength. It is not strength, it is fear. You are afraid that if you let anyone in, you will lose them, as you lost Honora, so you push them away before they can get close." Hadrian's hands, clasped behind his back, tightened until the knuckles whitened. His mother's voice softened. "I am not asking you to love anyone, Hadrian. I am asking you to see. Look at what is happening in your own house. Look at the girl. Not as a servant, but as a person. Ask yourself why a child who trusts no one trusts her. And then ask yourself whether your governess's judgment is really the one you wish to follow." She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts. "I will stay for a few days. I wish to observe for myself. And I wish to see the child. You will instruct Mrs. Arden to unlock the nursery." It was not a request. She left him standing at the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass, his mother's words lodged in him like splinters. That evening, Hadrian did something he had not done in months. He went to the nursery. He found Audley sitting on the floor in the corner of the room, her back to the wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. The room was sparse and ordered, everything in its place, the toys aligned on the shelf with military precision, the small bed made with tight, punishing corners. It was not a child's room, it was a cell disguised as one. Audley looked up when he entered, her eyes, so like his own, fixed on him with an expression he could not decipher. She did not move. She did not reach for him. She simply watched, the way a small animal watches a larger one, assessing the threat. Hadrian knelt. The movement was stiff and awkward. He was not accustomed to kneeling. He looked at his niece, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the thinness of her wrists, at the raw, bitten edges of her fingernails. Honora's daughter. Honora's eyes in a smaller, more fragile face. The guilt struck him with a force that nearly stole his breath. After a long moment, Ottilie uncurled one arm. She extended it slowly, her small hand reaching toward his face. Her fingers hovered in the air, trembling, inches from his cheek. She held them there, not quite touching, as if she were testing whether he was real. Then she withdrew her hand. She tucked it back against her chest and looked away. Hadrian stood. He left the room without a word. He walked to his study, unlocked the door, and sat down at his desk. He sat there for a very long time, staring at nothing. Then he pulled a clean sheet of paper toward him and began to write a letter. It was addressed to an old friend, a retired provost at Cambridge, a man with connections in the academic world and a talent for quiet inquiry. Hadrian described the girl as precisely as he could: her approximate age, her appearance, the name she used. He mentioned the incident with the equation on the blackboard. He mentioned her silence, her composure, her strange effect on the child. He asked the man to look for any record of a young woman matching this description. Educated, possibly of gentle birth, fallen on hard times. He asked for discretion. He sealed the letter and set it aside for the morning post. Only then did he allow himself to think about what his mother had said. No man wants a clever wife. He had spoken those words with the absolute certainty of a man defending a position he had never examined. Now, barely a week later, the certainty was gone, and in its place was a question he could not silence. What if he had been wrong? He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study as the candles burned down, turning that question over in his mind, and somewhere in the vast sleeping house, a small girl sat in the corner of her locked room, and a young woman lay in her narrow bed with her eyes open, and all three of them waited for a dawn that seemed very far away. The days that followed the separation were the hardest Carenza had endured since arriving at Aldermere. Mrs. Arden, emboldened by her success in isolating the child, turned her attention to a broader campaign. She did not merely want Nell away from Ottilie. She wanted Nell gone. The tasks became punitive. Carenza was removed from the East Wing entirely and assigned to the cellar level. She spent her mornings hauling coal scuttles up 3 flights of back stairs. Her afternoons were consumed by the laundry where the steam and the lye soap cracked her hands until they bled. Her evenings were spent in the servants' hall, mending by candlelight until her eyes burned, under the direct supervision of Mrs. Arden's ally, the nursemaid Brant. She was being ground down. She could feel it in her body, in the deep ache of her shoulders, in the persistent rawness of her hands, in the way her legs trembled on the cellar stairs. She was losing weight. The food she was given, always the last to be served, and the smallest portion was barely enough to sustain her. But it was the isolation that cut deepest. The other maids who had once been politely indifferent to her now avoided her entirely. Mrs. Arden had done her work well. Nell was trouble. Nell was marked. Carenza ate alone. She worked alone. She slept in a narrow room at the end of the servants' corridor, and she lay awake each night listening to the sound of the sea through the thin window, planning and discarding and planning again. The study. She had to get into the study. But the study was on the 2nd floor in the Duke's private wing, behind a door that was always locked. The key was on the Duke's person at all times. The corridor leading to it was within earshot of the Duke's own bedchamber. There was no approach that did not carry the risk of certain discovery and certain ruin. She had considered every option. She knew there was a window of roughly 40 minutes each evening when the Duke walked the cliff path before dinner. 40 minutes when the study was unoccupied and the corridor was empty, but the door would still be locked. And she had no key. Unless the door was not locked, the idea came to her in the cellar as she wrung sheets through the mangle. She did not need a key. She needed the door to be unlocked before she arrived. And there was one person in the household whose presence in the Duke's private wing would go unchallenged: Mrs. Arden herself. The governess visited the Duke's study regularly. Carenza had observed it weeks ago, Every Tuesday and Friday, Mrs. Arden delivered a written report on Audley's progress to the Duke's desk. She had a key of her own, a privilege granted by the Duke in recognition of her trusted position. She would enter, place the report on the desk, and leave. If Carenza could time her approach to coincide with Mrs. Blank's Arden's departure. There would be a moment, a brief, vanishing moment, when the door was unlocked but the corridor was empty. Mrs. Arden always relocked the door behind her, but there was a space of seconds between her stepping out and turning the key. If Carenza could be close enough, hidden in the alcove by the linen cupboard, she could slip through the door before it was locked. It was reckless. It was desperate. It was the only chance she was going to get. She chose a Friday. Mrs. Arden's Friday reports were always delivered at 5:30, just before the household began preparations for dinner. The Duke would be on his cliff walk. The corridor would be deserted. She spent the preceding days in careful preparation. She memorized the route from the cellar stairs to the second-floor corridor. She counted the steps, timed the walk, identified every creaking floorboard and every squeaking hinge. On Friday morning, she worked her assigned tasks with the same quiet diligence she always displayed. She gave no sign, no flicker of intention, nothing that could alert the watchful eyes that followed her through every hour of the day. At 5:15, she descended to the cellar. She had been assigned to sort a delivery of candles, a task that would keep her occupied until well past 6. She opened the crates, began arranging the candles on the shelves, and counted the minutes. At 5:20, she put down the candle she was holding and walked to the cellar stairs. Her heart was a fist beating against her ribs. Her mouth was dry. Her hands, cracked and raw from the lie, were trembling at her sides. She climbed the stairs. Ground floor, service corridor. The green baize door that separated the servants' world from the family's. She eased it open, slipped through, and closed it behind her without a sound. She turned left, toward the secondary staircase, the narrow, uncarpeted flight used by the upper housemaids. It was steeper and darker, but it emerged into the corridor only 15 feet from the linen cupboard alcove. She climbed. Each step was an act of will. The house seemed to hold its breath around her, every silence magnified, every distant sound amplified into a threat. She reached the second floor. The corridor stretched before her, paneled in dark oak, lit by a single window at the far end through which the late afternoon light fell in a pale, slanting column. The study door was 20 feet to her right. The linen cupboard alcove was 5 feet to her left. She pressed herself into the alcove. She could see the study door. She could see the entire corridor. She forced her breathing to slow, counting each inhalation, each exhalation, the way her father had taught her to count when a problem seemed insurmountable. At precisely 5:30, she heard footsteps. Mrs. Arden's footsteps were unmistakable, a crisp, metronomic tap of low heels on oak. They grew louder, ascending the main staircase, approaching along the corridor. Mrs. Arden appeared. She walked with her usual rigid posture, a folded paper in one hand, a ring of keys in the other. She reached the study door, selected a key, and unlocked it. She entered. The door swung closed behind her but did not latch. It rested against the frame, a hair's breadth from shut. Carenza waited. She counted the seconds against the pulse in her throat. 1, 2, 3, 15, 20, 30. The door opened again. Arden stepped out, the folded paper gone from her hand. She turned back to the door, reaching for the handle to pull it closed, the key already rising toward the lock. Carenza heard the key slide into the mechanism. She heard the click of the lock engaging. Too late. She had hesitated. She had waited one breath too long, paralyzed by the enormity of what she was about to do. And now the door was locked, and Mrs. Arden was walking away, her heels tapping their brisk, receding rhythm down the corridor. Carenza stood in the alcove, her body rigid, her nails digging crescents into her palms. She had failed. The chance had come and gone in a span of seconds, and she had let it slip through her fingers like sand. She closed her eyes. Despair pressed down on her like a physical weight. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the cupboard door and allowed herself 5 seconds of absolute defeat. Then she opened her eyes. Because in the silence left by Mrs. Arden's departing footsteps, she heard another sound. A sound that changed everything. A small, soft click. Not the click of a lock, but the click of a latch. And then, impossibly, the slow, quiet creak of a door opening. Carenza turned her head and looked down the corridor. The study door was open. Not fully, not wide, just a few inches. A sliver of warm light from the window inside fell across the dark oak floor of the corridor, in a thin, glowing line. Someone was inside the room. Someone had been inside the room the entire time. Someone who had been there before Mrs. Arden entered, who had sat in silence while the governess delivered her report, and who had now, deliberately and silently, opened the door. Carenza stared at that thin line of light, and the blood in her veins turned to ice. Because there was only one person in this house, who had a reason to be in that room, who had a key of his own, and who moved with the silent, watchful patience of a man accustomed to observing the world from the shadows. The Duke had not gone for his walk. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Carenza did not move. She could not. Her body had locked itself into the alcove like a creature caught in the open by a predator, every muscle frozen, every nerve screaming in 2 directions at once. Run, stay, run, stay. The thin line of light lay across the corridor floor like a blade. The study door was open. The Duke was inside. And between her and the staircase that led to safety, that open door stood like a mouth waiting to speak. She could retreat. She could slide backward, descend the narrow stairs, return to the cellar and the candle crates, and no one would ever know she had been here. It was the safe choice, the rational choice. But the papers were in that room. Her father's handwriting, his theorems, the proof that his life's work had been stolen. The only evidence in the world that could restore his name and reclaim her future. It was 20 feet away, behind a door that was for the first time in 4 months open. She stepped out of the alcove. She did not think about it. Thinking would have stopped her. She simply moved, the way she had moved when she completed the equation on the blackboard. Instinctively, before the conscious mind could intervene with its catalog of consequences. Her feet carried her across the corridor in 3 silent strides. Her hand found the edge of the door. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The study was smaller than she had imagined. It was a square, paneled room with a single tall window that faced the sea. The last of the afternoon light poured through the glass, turning the room the color of old honey. There was a desk, broad and orderly, with a brass lamp and a leather blotter. There were shelves lining 2 walls, filled not with books but with boxes and folders, the archived papers of the Ashworth estate. There was a fireplace with a cold grate, and above it, a portrait of a woman with kind eyes and silver hair. And there in the wing-back chair beside the fireplace sat the Duke. He was not standing, he was not at the desk. He was sitting in the deep leather chair, one leg crossed over the other, his hands resting on the arms, his posture so still he might have been part of the furniture. He was watching her with an expression that contained no surprise at all. He had been waiting for her. He had known she would come. The realization struck her like a slap. The open door was not an accident. It was an invitation, or a trap. Carenza stood just inside the threshold, her hand still on the door. She could see his face clearly now, and what she saw there was not anger. It was something far more dangerous. It was the full, undivided, intensely focused attention of a man who had spent his life solving problems and had just encountered one that genuinely interested him. "Close the door," he said. Carenza closed the door. The click of the latch was deafening. In the silence, she stood with her back to it, her hands flat against the wood behind her, her chin raised. She would not cower. She had made her choice by walking through that door, and she would stand by it. Hadrian regarded her for a long moment. His eyes moved over her face with a slow, methodical precision, as if he were cataloging her features, comparing them against some internal record. His gaze dropped to her hands, pressed against the door. Red, cracked, trembling slightly. Then back to her face. "You were in the corridor," he said. It was not a question. "Waiting for Mrs. Arden to leave." Carenza said nothing. Silence was the only defense she had left. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward in the chair, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "I have been watching you," he said, "since the evening in the gallery, since you walked away from my niece. Mend. I have been trying to understand what manner of woman walks away from a child who is reaching for her and does it not out of cruelty, but out of discipline. No amount of training, no depth of obedience, produces that kind of self-control in a housemaid. It is the discipline of someone who has been taught to sacrifice comfort for a larger purpose." He paused. The silence between them was charged, electric, a living thing. "Then I remembered the equation," he continued. "Mrs. Arden reported it to me weeks ago. She thought it was evidence of your presumption. I thought it was curious, but insignificant. I was wrong. A junior housemaid does not solve a problem in advanced mathematics by accident. She does it because she has been educated, rigorously, deeply, by someone who knew what they were doing. So I wrote a letter," Hadrian said, "to a friend at Cambridge. I described you. I asked him to search for any record of a young woman of education and gentle birth who had recently disappeared from public life. He wrote back 3 days ago. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded letter. He did not open it. He held it loosely in his fingers, watching her face. He found nothing under the name Nell, but he found a great deal under another name. A name that is known in certain academic circles. A name attached to a mathematician of extraordinary reputation, a man called Amory Liddell. The sound of her father's name in this room, spoken in this voice, broke something inside her. It was a fracture. She felt physically a sharp, hot crack that ran from her throat to the center of her chest. Her vision blurred. Her jaw tightened. She pressed her hands harder against the door behind her and held on. Hadrian watched the impact of the name cross her face like a shadow. He saw the fracture. He saw her fight to contain it. And he saw with a clarity that cut through every assumption he had ever made about her that this was not the reaction of a woman caught in a lie. This was the reaction of a woman hearing her father's name spoken with respect for the first time in 2 years. He stood. The movement was slow and deliberate. He set the letter on the arm of the chair and took 2 steps toward her, then stopped. He did not crowd her. He left a careful distance between them, the distance of a man who understood that the woman before him was on the edge of something vast and that pushing too hard would shatter what remained. "Miss Liddell," he said quietly. The name undid her. She did not weep or collapse. She simply stopped holding the rigid architecture of control that she had maintained for 4 months, for 2 years, for every waking moment since the morning she had been told her father's life work belonged to someone else, simply gave way. Her shoulders dropped, her chin lowered, her hands slid from the door and hung at her sides. She stood before him stripped of every pretense, every mask, and she was just herself, Carenza Liddell, Emery's daughter, tired and frightened and utterly alone. "Why did you come here?" he asked. His voice had changed. The cool formality was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded, something that sounded almost like pain. "What are you looking for in this room?" she told him. "Not everything. Not all at once, but enough." She told him about her father's treatise. She told him about Arden, the assistant who had copied it, published it, claimed it. She told him about the forged will, the stolen property, the solicitor who could not be trusted. She told him that her father had been a guest of the late Duke, that he had entrusted certain papers to him for safekeeping, original manuscripts in his own hand that would prove beyond any doubt that the published work was stolen. She told him that Mrs. Arden, the governess of his household and the guardian of his niece, was the sister of the man who had committed the theft. The silence that followed this final revelation was unlike any that had come before. It was not empty, it was full, saturated with the weight of implications that spread outward like cracks in ice. Hadrian's face had gone very still. His hands closed into fists, not in violence but in the slow, controlled compression of a man containing an enormous pressure. He turned away from her. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the sea, his reflection transparent in the glass, superimposed on the gray water and the darkening sky. "My father," he said. "My father took those papers from yours and promised to keep them safe. Yes, and when my father died, no one knew they were here. No one except Dr. Campion. He wrote to me. He told me where to look. And you came here. You put on a maid's dress and you scrubbed my floors, and you endured the cruelties of the woman whose brother ruined your father, and you did it alone, without help, without telling a single soul." He pressed his forehead against the glass. He closed his eyes. "I said no man wants a clever wife," he murmured. "And all the while, the cleverest woman I have ever met was on her knees in my cellar washing my laundry, because I was too blind to see what was happening in my own house." He turned from the window. His face was stripped bare now, every defense removed. What she saw there was not pity. It was not guilt, though guilt was part of it. It was recognition. He was seeing her, not the maid, not the disguise. Her, Carenza, the scholar's daughter, with the mathematician's mind and the courage to walk into the house of her enemy and search for the truth. He crossed the room to the shelves. He began to pull down boxes, folders, bundles of letters tied with ribbon. "My father kept his personal correspondence here," he said, "separated by year. If your father's papers are anywhere, they will be in the collection from the years he visited." He paused a box in his hands and looked at her. "Will you help me look?" It was not a command. It was not a request from a duke to a servant. It was an appeal from one person to another, offered across the gulf of everything that separated them. Carenza walked to the shelves. She took the box from his hands. Their fingers touched. The contact was brief, a fraction of a second, but it carried the weight of everything that had been unspoken between them. The watching, the waiting, the slow, reluctant recognition of one lonely soul by another. They searched together. The light outside faded. Hadrian lit the lamp on the desk, and the room contracted around them, becoming smaller, warmer, intimate. They worked in silence, opening boxes, scanning letters, checking dates. It was Carenza who found it. She was sitting on the floor, her legs folded beneath her, a box of letters from 1823 open on her lap. Her hands had stopped moving. She was holding a leather folio, thin and cracked with age, and her face had gone white. She opened the folio. Inside were pages covered in a handwriting she would have recognized anywhere, in any language, in any light. Small, precise, elegant. The hand of a man who wrote mathematics the way other men wrote poetry, with a grace that made the symbols seem inevitable. Her father's hand. She turned the pages. Theorems, proofs, marginal annotations in his characteristic red ink, the original drafts of the core chapters of the treatise, and beneath them, folded into a separate envelope, a letter addressed to the Duke in her father's hand, dated 6 months before his death. "My Lord Duke," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, "I fear my time grows short. The illness that has plagued me this past year shows no sign of relenting, and I find I must make provisions for that which matters most to me in this world. Not my reputation, which is a vain and transient thing, but the future of my daughter, Carenza." Her voice broke. She pressed her hand to her mouth and held it there, her eyes squeezed shut, the tears running silently down her cheeks. Hadrian knelt beside her. He did not take the letter. He did not touch her. He simply knelt, close enough that she could feel his presence, and waited. She steadied herself. She continued reading. I have enclosed the original manuscripts of my treatise and certain personal papers. I have come to suspect that my assistant, Mr. Arden, harbors ambitions that extend beyond his abilities, and I do not trust him with my daughter's legacy. Should anything happen to me, I beg you to see that these documents are placed into Carenza's hands. She alone will understand their significance. She alone can carry the work forward. The letter ended with a simple, devastating line. She is the best of me, and I leave her in your care. The silence that followed was absolute. The lamp flickered. The sea moved far below the window, invisible in the darkness. Your father trusted mine, Hadrian said, and his voice was thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. My father failed that trust. He died, and the papers were forgotten, and you were left to face Arden alone. This is not your failure, Miss Lydell. It is mine. It is my family's, and I intend to make it right. He stood and offered her his hand. She took it. He pulled her gently to her feet, and for a moment they stood face to face in the lamplight, her hand still in his, the folio pressed between them. His grip was firm and warm, and she could feel the restraint in it, the careful control of a man who was holding himself back from something he was not yet ready to name. He released her hand. He stepped back. These papers will be secured tonight, he said. Tomorrow I will send for my solicitor. The legal process will begin immediately. But there is something else that must happen first, Mrs. Montand. Arden, he said, and the name fell from his lips like a stone dropped into still water. She is the sister of the man who did this to you. She has been living in my house, governing my niece, and all the while her family has profited from the destruction of yours. She will answer for it. Not tomorrow. Tonight. He rang the bell. The footman who answered was a young man named Tolliver, steady and discreet. Hadrian gave 2 instructions. Bring Mrs. Arden to the study. Then find the maid Nell and bring her here as well. Tolliver looked confused. Be your grace. The maid is all ready. He stopped. He had seen Carenza standing by the shelves. He blinked, his composure faltering for the first time. Hadrian said nothing. Tolliver collected himself, bowed, and left. She will deny it, Carenza said quietly. She will say she knew nothing of her brother's actions. Perhaps, Hadrian said, but the truth does not require her agreement. They waited. Carenza stood by the window, her hands clasped in front of her, the leather folio on the desk between them. Hadrian stood behind the desk, his posture formal, his expression settling into the hard, remote authority that the household knew and feared. The door opened. Mrs. Arden entered. She was dressed in her customary black, her posture rigid, her face composed. She had come expecting a routine discussion. She was not prepared for what she found. Her gaze swept the room. She saw the Duke behind the desk. She saw the open boxes, the scattered papers, the leather folio, and she saw Nell, standing by the window, in the lamplight, not standing the way a maid stands. Standing straight, her chin raised, her gray-green eyes steady, her entire bearing transformed by a subtle but unmistakable shift. The disguise was still there, the gray dress, the chapped hands, the plain cap, but the woman inside it had changed. She had stopped pretending. Mrs. Arden knew. In the first second, before a word was spoken, she knew. Carenza could see it in the way the color left the governess's face in stages, draining downward like water emptying from a glass. Sit down, Mrs. Arden, Hadrian said. The governess did not move. Sit down, he repeated, and this time the words carried a weight that was not merely authority but judgment. She sat. Hadrian did not. He remained standing behind the desk, looking down at her. Your brother's name is Arden, he said. He is a scholar, or rather, he passes for one. Mrs. Arden's hands tightened in her lap. 2 years ago, he continued, he published a mathematical treatise, a work of extraordinary significance. He received a chair at Cambridge. He received honors, recognition, wealth. He built his entire career upon that work. The work was not, his Hadrian said. Every theorem, every proof, every line of original thought in that treatise was written by a man named Emery Liddell. Your brother stole it. He copied the manuscripts, restructured the chapters, and published it under his own name while Liddell was dying. And when Liddell was dead, your brother forged a will, bribed a solicitor, and stole the man's property, leaving his only daughter destitute. He picked up the folio from the desk and opened it. The pages of her father's handwriting were visible, the red ink annotations, the small, elegant script. These are the original manuscripts, he said, in Liddell's own hand. They have been in this house for 3 years, entrusted to my late father for safekeeping. And this, he held up her father's letter, is Liddell's own testimony, written before his death, naming your brother as the man he feared would steal his work. Did you know? He asked. The question fell into the silence like a hammer blow. Mrs. Arden's composure, the rigid, unyielding facade she had maintained for 18 months of service, cracked. It did not shatter. It cracked, the way a dam cracks, with a slow spreading fracture that lets through first a trickle and then a flood. I did not, she began. Hadrian held up his hand. Before you answer, I want you to understand what is at stake. If you lie to me now, in this room, with the evidence on this desk, I will not simply dismiss you. I will have you prosecuted as an accessory to fraud. If, however, you tell me the truth, the full truth, I will show you more mercy than you showed the woman standing in this room. So I will ask you once more. Did you know? The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. The lamp hissed softly. The sea murmured against the cliffs. Mrs. Arden broke. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was a slow, grinding surrender, the kind that comes from the accumulated weight of years of complicity finally becoming too heavy to carry. I knew, she whispered. Not at first. Not when he published, but after, when the girl disappeared and the property was sold. He told me what he had done. He said the old man's work would have been wasted, that Liddell was too ill to publish, that the ideas deserved to see the light. He said the girl was nothing, a nobody, that she would marry some clerk and forget her father's equations within a year. And then she came here, the governess continued. I did not recognize her at first. She was so changed, so thin, so quiet. But then I saw her with the blackboard, and I knew. Those hands. I had seen them before, in her father's study, turning pages, holding chalk. She has her father's hands. I was afraid, she said. I was afraid she would find the papers. I was afraid she would ruin my brother. I was afraid I would lose everything I had built. So I tried to drive her out. I kept the child away from her because the child made her visible, and visibility was dangerous. She looked at Hadrian. I did not know they were in this room. I swear it. If I had known, I would have. She stopped. The sentence hung in the air unfinished, its completion obvious and damning. You would have destroyed them, Hadrian said. Mrs. Arden closed her eyes. The Duke let the silence do its work. You will leave this house tonight, he said, his voice weary. A carriage will be waiting within the hour. You will be taken to the inn at Charmouth. From there, you will make your own arrangements. I will provide a month's wages and nothing more. There will be no reference. There will be no pension. He looked at Carenza. She was standing very still, her face pale, her eyes bright with unshed tears, but she was not looking at Mrs. Bott. Arden with hatred or triumph. She was looking at her with something far more complex, something that contained pity and exhaustion and the bone-deep relief of a woman who has carried a secret for so long that its removal feels less like victory than like the setting down of an impossible weight. He turned back to the governess. As for your brother, my solicitor will be in London by the end of the week. The original manuscripts will be examined by independent scholars. The fraud will be established. Your brother's career, his chair, his reputation, all of it will be dismantled, and Miss Liddell's property will be restored to her. Mrs. Arden stood. Her movements were slow, arthritic, as if she had aged a lifetime in the span of 20 minutes. She walked to the door, her back curved, her head bowed. "The child," she said, her voice barely audible. "Ottilie, she will be cared for," Hadrian cut in, "as she should have been from the beginning. That is no longer your concern." The door closed behind her. Her footsteps receded down the corridor, growing fainter and fainter until they were swallowed by the silence of the house. Carenza and the Duke were alone. For a long moment neither of them moved. The lamp burned steadily. The leather folio lay open on the desk, her father's handwriting glowing softly in the warm light. "Thank you," she said. The words were inadequate. She knew it. But they were all she had. Hadrian shook his head. "Do not thank me. I have done nothing to deserve it. You were in my house for 4 months. You scrubbed my floors. You endured the persecution of a woman whose family had already taken everything from you. And I sat in this room and did nothing, because it was easier to look at ledgers than to look at the people under my roof." He walked around the desk and stood before her. "My father failed. Yours," he said. "And I failed you. That is a debt that I intend to spend a very long time repaying." He reached past her to the desk and picked up the folio. He held it out to her with both hands, the way one presents something precious, something sacred. "Monsieur, these belong to you," he said. "They always did." Carenza took the folio. She held it against her chest, the leather warm from the lamplight, and felt her father's presence in it, his patience, his brilliance, his quiet, unshakable belief that the truth would eventually find its way home. The tears came then. Not the silent, controlled tears of a woman holding herself together, but the deep, shuddering tears of release, the kind that come only when the worst is truly over, when the weight has been lifted, when the long, dark corridor has finally opened into light. Hadrian did not touch her. He simply stood beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, his solidity, his steady, patient presence, and he let her weep. When the tears subsided, she looked up at him. Her face was streaked and raw, and more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. "What happens now?" she asked. He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. It was the first tremor of one, a movement at the corner of his mouth that hinted at a warmth he had spent years suppressing. "Now," he said quietly, "we begin." 3 months had passed, and summer had come to the Dorset coast. The cliffs above Aldermere were crowned with wild thyme and sea campion, and the light that poured through the study window was no longer the pale, grudging light of winter, but a warm, generous gold that found every corner and warmed every surface. The room had changed. The boxes and folders that had lined the shelves were gone, replaced by orderly rows of bound manuscripts, indexed and catalogued in a clear, elegant hand. A second desk had been installed beneath the window, smaller than the Duke's, with a brass inkwell and a stack of fresh paper, and a small glass jar filled with sea lavender. Carenza sat at this desk, writing. She was no longer in a maid's gray dress. She wore a simple gown of deep blue linen, the kind of gown a scholar might wear, practical and unadorned, but cut from good cloth. Her dark hair was unpinned, falling in a loose plait over one shoulder. Her hands, though still faintly scarred from the months of lye and coal, were healing. The redness was gone. The cracks had closed. They were becoming, once more, the hands of a woman who held chalk and turned pages. She was not the mistress of Aldermere. Not yet. She was its scholar in residence, a title Hadrian had invented with the quiet, methodical thoroughness he applied to all things. After that night in the study, events had moved swiftly. His solicitor had traveled to London and begun proceedings against Arden. The original manuscripts had been examined by 3 independent scholars, all of whom had confirmed without reservation that the published treatise was the work of Emery Liddell. Arden's chair had been revoked. His reputation, which had been built on sand, collapsed with the speed and finality of a wave retreating from a cliff. The forged will had been overturned. Briar Cottage was hers again. But Carenza had not gone back to Somerset. Hadrian had asked her to stay. "The study needs a proper custodian," he had said, standing in the doorway of this very room, his hands behind his back, his expression carefully neutral in the way it always was when he was trying to conceal how much the answer mattered to him. "My father's papers, the correspondence with his scholars, the collection he built, it is a body of work that deserves preservation, and there is no one better qualified than the daughter of the man who contributed most to it." It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it, but the offer was real, and the rooms in the East Wing were comfortable, and the desk by the window faced the water, and the man who had placed the sea lavender in the glass jar had done so without comment, as if flowers simply appeared in studies of their own accord. She had accepted. The door opened now, and Hadrian entered. He had changed in these 3 months, though the changes were subtle. The severe black coats had given way to warmer colors. The deep lines around his eyes had softened, not disappeared, but eased, as if some internal pressure had been partially released. He moved differently through his own house, with less rigidity, less of the mechanical formality that had once made him seem like a man performing the role of himself. He was carrying something. A sheet of paper, held carefully, the way one carries a thing of enormous significance that is also very small. He crossed the room and stood at the edge of her desk, looking down at her with an expression she had come to know well. The almost smile, the warmth banked behind the formal reserve, the eyes that said more than his words ever could. He set the paper on the desk. Carenza looked at it. It was a drawing, done in a child's hand. The lines were clumsy and uncertain, the proportions wildly wrong, but the subject was unmistakable. 2 figures, one tall and one very small, standing beside a large, shapeless form that might have been a dog or a boulder or a very generous interpretation of a horse. Above the figures in large, crooked letters were 2 words. For Carenza. She stared at it. Her hand rose to her mouth. "She drew it this morning," Hadrian said, and his voice was rough at the edges. Miss Cope found her at the nursery table with the crayons. She had been working on it for an hour. Miss Cope was the new governess, a young woman from Lyme Regis, with a gentle manner and an instinctive understanding of children who had been hurt. Under her care, the locked doors had been opened. The rigid schedules had been dismantled. Audley had begun slowly and with great caution to emerge from the fortress of silence. She had built around herself. She had not spoken yet. But she had begun to communicate in other ways. She pointed. She tugged sleeves. She led people by the hand to things she wanted them to see. And now, she drew. Carenza traced the crooked letters with her fingertip. The tears were there again, but they were different now. They were warm, simple, grateful. Hadrian watched her face. He had fallen in love with her. He knew it now. With the same certainty with which he knew the tides and the turning of the seasons. It had not happened in a single moment. It had happened in the accumulation of 100 small ones. The way she held a book. The way she spoke to Audley, not with the bright, desperate cheerfulness of the nursemaids, but with a quiet, steady presence that asked nothing and offered everything. The way she argued with him about Euclid over dinner, her eyes alight, her voice sharp with the pleasure of intellectual combat. The way she had stood in this room on the worst night of her life and met his gaze without flinching. He had said no man wants a clever wife. He had been a fool. He had been worse than a fool. He had been afraid, and his fear had made him cruel, and his cruelty had made him blind. He was not blind now. Carenza, he said. She looked up. He almost never used her given name. When he did, it meant the words that followed had been weighed and measured and found to be necessary. "I've been thinking," he said, and the formality of the phrase was belied by the intensity in his eyes, "about what I said at dinner that night, about clever wives." She tilted her head. She did not help him. She let him find his own way to it, the way she let Audley find her own way to the crayons and the crooked letters. "I was wrong," he said. The words came slowly, each one placed with care, like stones laid in a path across uncertain ground. "I was wrong, and I have spent these months trying to find a way to say so. That does not sound like a retraction made under duress, so I will simply say what is true. I do not want a peaceful house. I want a house with you in it. I want arguments about mathematics at the breakfast table. I want someone who finishes the equations I cannot solve. I want a wife who is cleverer than I am, because I have met her, and the thought of her being anywhere else is something I am no longer willing to consider." He stopped. The silence held. The sea moved below the cliffs. The light was golden and warm and still. Carenza stood. She picked up the child's drawing from the desk and held it between them, the two crooked figures and the shapeless, beloved form beside them. "You should know," she said, and her voice was steady and clear and full of a quiet joy that had been 2 years in the making, "that I intend to argue with you about far more than mathematics." "Then I shall consider myself fortunate," he said. And this time, he smiled. Not the almost smile, not the careful, controlled hint of warmth. A real smile, full and unreserved, the smile of a man who had spent years in shadow and had finally, willingly, stepped into the light. He took her hand. She let him. And Carenza Lydell, who had come to Aldermere House with nothing but a false name and a desperate hope, stood in the golden study with her father's papers on the shelves around her, and a child's drawing in her hand and the hand of a man who had learned at last to see what had been in front of him all along. Outside, on the terrace below, Audley sat on the warm stone steps with Miss Cope beside her. She was drawing again, her dark head bent over the paper, her small fingers gripping the crayon with fierce concentration. Beside her, stretched out in a patch of sunlight, lay a great marmalade cat that had appeared at the kitchen door 3 weeks ago and refused to leave. It had taken one look at the silent child and settled itself against her side with the boneless, absolute certainty of an animal that has found the person it was meant to find. Audley had rested her hand on its warm flank, and the cat had purred, and something in the child's face had shifted, a softening, a loosening, the first visible sign of the long, slow thaw. She looked up from her drawing, now, toward the study window, as if she could sense the change taking place above her. She put down her crayon. She opened her mouth. And in a voice so small and rusty with disuse that it was barely more than a breath, she spoke her first word in over a year. "Home."